Welcome to our group's presentation on our research about Fulbright Student Council election. For our presentation, we would like to share with you the background on why we decided to follow this research topic, our findings, and how we researched them, and as well as a discussion of the findings. For the most recent and first ever Student Council election, there were only 122 eligible votes, while for the cohort representatives, there were only 140 eligible votes, which means that with only under 50% of the student body voting for each, we thought that there should be more research done to learn more about why Fulbright students decide to vote or not. So our research tries to gain more insight into the characteristics of Fulbright networks when considering voting behavior, understand how information is distributed over Fulbright's different social networks, and finally bring more valuable knowledge for the improvement of Fulbright election procedures in general for the future elections. For our research, we generated two main hypotheses. The first one is students who spend more time and effort for Fulbright and the Fulbright community in general are more likely to vote for the student council. The second one is that students who participate in the same social networks, i.e. having the same groups of friends or joining many of the same clubs, will display similar levels of interest in voting for the student council election. The direction of our research, such as the hypothesis that students who are more connected are more likely to vote, is based on the knowledge of social networks learned in class, concepts such as homophily, and we try to use our understanding of statistical analysis as well as Python coding to do most of our research. Firstly, we investigated the relationship between number of friends students socialize with outside of class and whether or not the students voted. We tried to build graphs to see the connections between the students, but unfortunately, with this jumble of nodes, we can't really see any concrete conclusions. So we also tried to see if there were big differences in the number of friends between those who voted and those who didn't, and couldn't find any significant differences. Next, we look at the best friends of students. Again, we were met with the same problem as before, not much to draw conclusions on. After that, we investigated the number of hours a student usually spends on campus each day, and once again, no significant difference was found between the groups of voters and non-voters, with the means of each being quite similar to each other. Next is whether studying in the STEM field or not had any effect on voting. And we were met with quite the surprising finding that the ratio of non-voters to voters in both groups were exactly the same, 0.666, so there was no difference there. We also looked into whether or not there was a difference in number of clubs that voters and non-voters participated in. We found a slight difference in non-voting ratings between non-clubs and club members, with a ratio of non-voters to voters and non-club members being about 0.8 and club members being about 0.72. Making the difference out to be only 0.08. But one limitation is that this number alone could not tell much about whether or not there was a significant difference between the two groups, so further investigation is needed. After this was study hours per week. Finally, we found a very interesting and surprising difference in the weekly study time between voters and non-voters, with a mean study time of voters and non-voters being 40.54 and 29.87 respectively. The distribution of samples themselves looked like they could be normal, so we ran tests to make sure that they were actually normal distributions, and then checked if the difference is significant or not. And the p-value of the t-test turned out to be 0.00035, significantly lower than the 0.05 threshold. With this finding, we tried to find supporting evidence that could explain what we found through the number of friends a student studies with at Fulbright. Again, we were met with not much to conclude when drawing graphs of studied friends, and further analysis couldn't help us find any meaningful relationships. So in the end, only the finding that students who voted studied longer hours in a week confirmed our initial hypothesis that students who put more time and effort into Fulbright had higher likelihood of voting. Maybe further investigation into aspects of that affect study time could help us understand more about our finding. One thing that we can suggest for further investigation is to look at whether or not specific courses or clubs that students participate in could affect voting decision. Our research is not without its flaws. Regarding the data, we suspect that more concrete conclusions could have been reached if the sample size had been bigger, and we think that investigation into the effects of majors couldn't find much because many students still haven't decided on a major yet at Fulbright. Another thing is that our findings about the voting behavior between those who were in clubs and those who weren't couldn't generate more meaningful conclusions because we don't know how to further analyze the 0.08 difference, and we don't really know if the difference is significant or not. So that is our presentation. Thank you for listening.